Good morning, lovelies. Child has been dropped off at school, this time with his backpack. And we're going to talk about conformity. For those of you who don't know, I'm Miriam. I'm running a series on ingrained values of whiteness culture, specifically as regards to the United States, and specifically as regards to people who have been raised in the white women box in the United States. So, we've talked about hierarchy, which is how whiteness culture is structured. Now we're talking about conformity. So if hierarchy is the train, conformity is the engine. If hierarchy is the tower, conformity is the stairs. Some people have access to the elevator. That's another video. If hierarchy is the treasure hunt, conformity is the map. Conformity is how you get to where you're going in the hierarchy. So the first thing I need to establish when I'm talking about conformity in whiteness spaces is that conformity in whiteness spaces is a top-down thing, okay? It's not a person-to-person thing. You're not trying to conform to what the people around you are doing. You're trying to meet an ideal. Everyone individually is trying to meet an ideal at the top of the hierarchy, and you're all trying to meet it slightly better than the person next to you. Right? So it's inherently competitive. This is an inherently competitive conformity. And that, again, we talked about how competitive works like in hierarchy. It's also a factor in how we're taught to conform, because we're not only taught to all conform to the same ideal, but we're taught to try to conform to that ideal better than the person next to us. So it's not keep up with the Joneses as I'm trying to be just like the Joneses. It's keep up with the Joneses as in like the Joneses being this ideal and you're trying to like keep up with it just as well or better than the people around you. So it's inherently competitive. This competition is, or this conformity is. And that makes it really, really easy to exploit for bad actors. And one of the things that we've been talking about that I kind of want to reiterate, because I haven't mentioned it in a few videos, is that these values that we're taught make us, as white people, make us really easy to control and really easy to exploit for bad actors and people higher up on the hierarchy. That's kind of what they're for. These are the things that are ingrained in us to keep us passive, compliant, diminish our empathy, like keep us in the machine, right? So conformity is a big part of that, because conformity, and we'll talk about this, is how you earn everything. Safety, humanity, security, friendship, right? And that makes it really, really hard to break away from. And so we're going to talk about, like, I'm going to break all of that down like a little bit, but that's kind of the overview of where we're going, is that the conformity that we are taught as white people, specifically as white Americans, and specifically as white women, is a conformity that cuts us off from community, weirdly enough, and also like keeps us like passive. So that's where we're going, and I'll see you in the next video. 2 morning videos. It's a Friday miracle. No, okay, so there's a thing that I want to talk about real quick, and it's not real quick, let's not lie. The thing that I want to talk about, I want to do the first video here unpacking conformity, and I wanted to do it really like early on, because I think it's really important to make sure that this is framed correctly as we move forward in the conversation. So this is an individualistic conformity. I said that in the previous video, but I want to unpack that a minute. What that means is you're not trying to be like the people around you as much as you're trying to be like the ideal in your head. And especially when you're younger, like the ideal in your head could be a person. Like when you're in high school and there's like the popular girl and you want to be like them. And so it can feel like the conformity we're raised with is trying to be like everybody else. But in reality, everyone's just trying to be like whatever ideal is at the top of their particular hierarchy. The reason this is important, and the reason I'm continuing to stress this, is because of how that affects people who want to be nonconformist. I have seen so many people, white people, let's be specific, be like, I'm not like the rest of them. I'm not like a sheep. I'm not whatever. But they're not nonconformist because they're living out of their authentic self. They're not nonconformist because they're going against the dehumanizing hierarchy. They're nonconformist because they've put an ideal at the top of their own personal little hierarchy that isn't the same as the ideal of the people around them. Does that make sense? So they're still conforming to an ideal, and they're still doing the policing, and they're still doing, which we'll talk about the policing in a minute, in another video. They're still like doing the gatekeeping. They're still doing the, I'm better at this than you, therefore you deserve less than I do. They're still doing all of that stuff, but they're doing it in a nonconformist way, so they're not conforming. Does that make sense? And that's really, really important to me that we understand this, okay? Because it's not about not being like the people around you or not being like the people that you think are stupid. It's about not trying to be someone you're not in order to gain security and power and safety, okay? So I really want us, and again, this so much. I mean, like, it shows up in so many, like, primarily white subcultures, hipsters. There was at that Portlandia sketch where the guy, every time he sees this one person doing something, he's like, this is over, because too many people are doing it, right? Like, that's what I'm talking about. There is a certain kind of nonconformist that has, I'm not doing what everyone else is doing at the top of their hierarchy. So it's not about actually bucking trends and being yourself. It's about, like, being in opposition to everyone else. And if you define yourself by your opposition to everyone else, you're going to have a lot of problems, especially in a progressive space. And we've seen that, right? We've seen people who are define themselves and their personalities as, you know, I don't go with the flow. I think for myself. I mean, at a very extreme level, like, those people are really easy to suck into cults, right? I did the research, like QAnon. I did the research, and I think for myself, and I don't think like all these sheep, right? But even on a lesser level, especially in progressive spaces, you have people who have built their entire identity around the idea that they are opposing the status quo, right? And so if they feel like this or that or the other space has become too status quo, they'll oppose it on principle, not because it has anything to do with, like, trying to reach goals to make a more progressive and equitable society. Equitable. Equitable society. And that's kind of like, that was kind of like an info dump right there, so hopefully you were able to follow it. But fundamentally, just to reiterate, this is an individualistic conformity, and it is possible to have that mindset and still be nonconformist. In fact, if you have that mindset and are trying to be nonconformist with that mindset, you can actually do a lot of damage, right? So I want to establish that up front. Okay? And I also want to establish that being nonconformist in our cases, this is what I think. Being nonconformist in terms of people who are, you know, raised in whiteness, especially people who are raised in white women's spaces, being nonconformist is about being your authentic self. Is about giving humanity to everyone, because that's the opposite of the hierarchy, right? It's about doing the things that you feel like, I don't know where I'm going with this. Why the fuck am I doing this? You know what? I have recorded this video. This is too long to re-record. So you're just going to have my blathering at the end, and we're all just going to pretend that's okay. And I'm going to see you in the next video, and I'm going to go in and get some more coffee. Okay? Have a good morning. I swear to God, my animals are my biggest op in this series. I'm being sabotaged by my menagerie. Jules, enough. It's not dinner time. What? You want to say hi to the people? Say hi to the people. Okay. So this comment reads, is this why white people will say, but I struggle too, and be so angry they haven't won yet when they are playing a game in their heads? They conformed and therefore they should be on top. Short answer, yes. But there are a few different factors here that I want to address. First of all, when you hear a white person say, but I struggled too, that's white people code for, I'm on the bottom of my hierarchy. I grew up on the bottom of my hierarchy, and I made my way up, or I'm still on the bottom of my hierarchy, and people treat me like shit. White people who say this, I mean, either they're racist and fine with it and don't think that people of other races, specifically black people, like, deserve things, or in many cases they're either primarily only experienced with white majority spaces, and so they don't have a concept of what it means to be a racial minority in a white space, or they're willfully ignorant and they don't want to think about it because it makes them feel bad. Which is also like white supremacy. Let's be clear about that. But basically, yes, when a white person says, I struggle too, what they're saying is, I'm on the bottom of my particular hierarchy, or I was on the bottom of my particular hierarchy and worked my way up. And so, therefore, you can't say that I have privilege or whatever. The other thing is, so angry that they haven't won yet. So that's kind of a bit of the trap as well. So we talked about hierarchy being fractal. So a fractal, again, is a shape that is similar at large scale as it is at small scale. So white supremacy and whiteness values structure themselves in the country the same way they do in the city, the same way they do in the country, the same way they do in the family, right? It differs in the details. But they're also nested, right? So it's kind of the big fish, little pond metaphor. So imagine that you're in a hierarchy and you do everything you're supposed to do, and you work your way all the way up to the hierarchy, and you do all the things to get the promise of security and stability and power and, you know, whatever it is that you've been promised by your particular hierarchy, the American dream. And then you realize that in the national hierarchy, which is again was created and is headed by which rich landowning white men, you still don't matter, right? Because you're not wealthy, or you're not a man, or you're not like in the class of politicians who make decisions, right? Because that is a problem. Why are all our politicians businessmen? Why? So you've done everything you're supposed to do to get what you're supposed to get. But then in the general country, you're still lower on the hierarchy than you think you should be. And that creates a lot of anger. Another thing that creates a lot of anger is the very classic white rage of someone getting something they don't deserve. And the way this relates to conformity is that, and we'll talk about this, conformity is very restrictive. And it can be really soul-killing. And if you have spent your life curtailing yourself and cutting off bits of yourself to try to fit a mold so that you can have security and stability and social power and community and money. and then there's someone out there who is getting those things without having to conform the way you have. Allow me to reference my earlier statement about my animals sabotaging me. Hang on. If there's someone out there who is getting the things that you have been working for, and in this working for sense, you have to understand, in this sense, working for it doesn't mean like effort or qualifications in terms of like objectively. It means the things that you cut off bits of yourself for. Like, you ever hear somebody be like, well, we all have to make sacrifices. A lot of times, when people say that, they are talking about sacrificing bits of themselves. So if there's someone out there who didn't have to sacrifice bits of themselves to get the things that you are trying to get, that can be absolutely infuriating. We talked about this actually on my post about the way that white women react to black women in business spaces, because black women have to be so qualified to be in those spaces that they often aren't as restricted in the way that they dress and present themselves as white women feel like they are. And that causes white women a great deal of anger in business spaces because they're already being passed over by mediocre white dudes who fit the standard better, the ideal better. And now this incredibly qualified black woman comes who has earned a spot not dependent on conformity. And that inspires a lot of rage, right? So yes, the conformity piece is a very big part of why white people don't understand privilege and why they get upset that they haven't gotten what they deserve. Good morning, lovelies. I have a super tight deadline for work this week, so I'm going to be a bit scarce, but I did want to hop on. I think I said in my About Me video that entering into white mom spaces when I became a parent was one of the things that helped trigger my pattern recognition around these things. And I was thinking about that the other day. If you want to see how internalized hierarchy functions, and you want to see this push not only to conform but to make everyone else conform, you could do a lot worse than browse some, almost a troll, don't troll, browse some like Facebook mom groups and mom forums. Not to say there are not good ones out there, but a lot of them are awful. And it's a really amazing little microcosm because of how things work in the wider area, because motherhood is such a close and important, like close to the heart, important identity for a lot of people. And so they have this ideal again, and then they're trying to get as close to the ideal as possible, and everyone below you is doing it wrong, right? But it's also a really interesting microcosm of a couple of other things that I wanted to bring up. One is that not everybody has the same ideal that they're trying to conform to. And this, I think, is kind of a problem in the United States because we are so large and we have so many different geographic and cultural subcultures, even like if you're only sticking with the white people. And so everybody's hierarchy is going to have like a little bit of a different ideal at the top. So if you have a hierarchy where your ideal is the opposite of someone else's ideal, and you get into you're trying to conform and they're trying to conform to theirs and you're trying to conform to yours, and you think they're doing it wrong and they think you're doing it wrong, that's really debilitating for building coalitions and communities. The other thing it's a really good example of is that in order to have this kind of control, in order to have this kind of conformity that whiteness and white supremacy need to enforce to perpetuate white supremacy and these systems, you have to make everything a moral choice. You have to make, it's not just you do you as long as you're not hurting anybody. Everything's got to be a moral choice. Everything's got to be, you're a good person if you do this, a bad person if you do this. And you really see that in a lot of mom forums. You see that moral absolutism, and that, I'm not really sure what to call it. I have to think about it. We talk about it. I know we talk about it in regards to religion a lot and people who grew up religious, but this is something I've seen in like all kinds of people, right? Is this moral absolutism about this is bad, this is good. And at some point I do want to talk about the characteristics of white supremacy. Black and white thinking is one of them, and how these relate to what I'm doing, but I need to kind of clarify and organize a bit more in my head before I do that. But that's part of where the black and white thinking comes from, is this need to assign morality to choices that don't necessarily have a moral value. And you can see that so clearly in mom forums, you know, breastfeeding versus formula feeding versus like, I mean, there are people who are like, if you did a C-section, you didn't really give birth and you're not a real mom. Like, this kind of conformity policing and toxic hierarchy is so vividly on display in white mom online spaces a lot of times that it can be a really good way to kind of acquaint yourself with what that looks like so you can spot it in the wider world. Anyway, that was basically what I wanted to say. I got to get back to work, but I hope you guys have a good day. I'm out here trying to do this while the dogs are playing. We'll see how that works. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, I'm doing a series of videos on internalized whiteness values, and right now we're talking about conformity, which is how one ascends the whiteness hierarchy. I'm doing this specifically with an emphasis on the United States, and specifically with an emphasis on people raised in the white women box, the socialist as white women. So, let's talk about the self-mutilative nature of conformity. So, when you are part of a colonialist hierarchy that cuts off empathy, you end up also, like that line, remember that line I talked about where it's like everybody you and above deserves empathy, sympathy, compassion? That line doesn't run, that line runs straight through. And in that system, under that system, there are parts of you that do not fit, right? And under that system, there are parts of you that you think do not deserve empathy, compassion, and understanding, and humanity. And so in order to conform, in order to gain the things that you want to get, security, happiness, whatever, you cut those parts off. You mutilate your own soul. And then sometimes your body, but that's a different video. So the thing that I really want to focus on in this video is that level of self-mutilation in pursuit of conformity creates a very strong incentive to preserve the status quo and to make sure everyone's playing by the same rules. And to some of you, that's not going to make sense. You're like, well, if the status quo is hurting everybody, why don't we change the status quo? If it's hurting you, why would you be opposed? So let me see if I can illustrate this by mutilating a fairy tale. So imagine you're one of Cinderella's stepsisters, okay? In a not Disney version of this tale. And let's assume you're reasonably conventionally attractive. You're just, comparatively speaking, and also behaviorally, you're an ugly stepsister. And you're doing all the things you're supposed to do, because you're supposed to make an advantaged marriage. So, you have deportment and, you know, do this, do that, dress this way, act this way, be a lady, you know, whatever. Don't be there just for the food. And you go to the ball, you hear the news. His Royal Highness Christopher Rupert is giving a ball. And rumor has it he will choose a wife with the ball. Okay, this is a game you've been trained to play. So, you get all dolled up, you get, you know, dressed up as well as you can, you go to the ball, you're charming, you wear the shoes that hurt, but whatever, mask your face, you try to charm the prince as best you can, you play the game. Unfortunately, some stranger shows up and steals the spotlight. Irritating, but whatever, that's how it goes sometimes. Then a couple days later, so you go home, a couple days later, you find out that there's a new set of rules in play. Now the prince says, whoever fits the shoe, I will marry the woman who can wear the shoe. Okay, let's give this a shot. So he shows up at your house, and you try on the shoe, and your foot's too wide. And your mom says, you should just cut off your toes. Because a princess doesn't need toes. A princess doesn't need to be balanced. Where you'll be running? You won't be running anywhere. You'll be a princess. Whatever. And you're like, okay. So you cut off your toes. One assumes wrap your foot. Jam your foot into the slipper. The prince is like, oh, okay. He puts you on his horse. He starts to ride away. And then he's like, oh, okay, that's a lot of blood. So he takes you back and he tries to put the slipper on your sister. Your sister's foot is too long. And your mom is like, well, just cut your heel off. Obviously, you won't need to be walking if you're a princess. You'll have servants that can carry you anywhere. You know, the level of wealth and privilege that you're going to get as a result of this sacrifice, self-mutilation, is going to make all of this irrelevant. It will not matter. So your sister cuts off her heel. And the prince, who admittedly in the story is not one of God's best and brightest, puts her on his horse and starts to ride away. And then he's like, that's also a lot of blood. That's so weird. So he comes back. Now, in the normal fairy tale, that's when Cinderella tries it on. It fits perfectly, happy ever after, right? But imagine it doesn't end that way. Imagine, on his way back, bringing back your sister, the prince meets another girl. She's never been in the story before. She wasn't at the ball. She has no context. Maybe she's a farmer's daughter. Maybe she's another noble girl come to visit. Maybe she's the doctor's assistant because you're trying to bandage your feet and someone called a physician. Does not matter. Between bringing your sister back and trying it on Cinderella, the prince meets another girl and he falls in love immediately. Instant sparks. Says, this is the girl for me, I'm not going to have any. He doesn't even try on the shoe. He just picks her up, puts her on his horse, rides away. Now, obviously that ending's not great for Cinderella, although we don't know. She just wanted to go to the party. Maybe she's fine with it. Maybe she's going to do a brandy and, like, go off to find the life and love she deserved, you know? Maybe she wasn't super interested in being queen. Maybe she liked the prince, but it was like she only knew him for a day, for a night. So we don't know how Cinderella feels like about it. We do know how the stepsisters feel about it, though, right? Because imagine you've just cut off a piece of your foot to try and become queen, and someone else gets to be queen who doesn't even have to try on the shoe. Imagine how that feels, right? And so now you have the stepsisters who are rapidly invested in making sure everyone plays by the same rules. They'd be mad if the shoe fit Cinderella, but at least she'd be playing by the rules, right? She'd be within the scope of the way the fairy tale works. But for an unknown woman to just come out of nowhere, doesn't have to go to the ball, doesn't have to try on the shoe, boom, princess. No, that's not fair. Right? And so that's the kind of emotional, someone's being brave. Hi, Caspers. You're being brave? That's the kind of emotional investment I'm talking about, right? And I'm going to elaborate on this some more, but the kind of emotional investment I'm talking about is this. I did this. I gave up things that were important to me to play by the rules that I was told. And now someone else has those things that I was trying to get, and they didn't have to do what I had to do. And this goes deeper than Jules is playing Fire Engine. Casper, you want to play Fire Engine? Okay. Anyway, as you can see, it creates an investment, and we can talk about how that plays out a lot. I want to talk about how that plays out a lot in white mom spaces. But I think I need to go. But yeah, I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that self-mutilation, when we talk about people voting against their own interests, you have to keep in mind that self-mutilation doesn't necessarily create a desire to change the system. It can, and very often does, create a very strong desire to maintain the system so that the things that you have given up and the sacrifices that you have made mean something. Does that make sense? Let's discuss. Good morning, lovelies. This one is specifically for my fellow white people. I mean, technically all of this series is for you guys. But this very specifically, I need you guys to lock in here. Everyone else can stay, but I need you guys to lock in. My fellow white people, lock in. One thing I really want us to internalize as we continue to talk about conformity and as we move into punishment, which is the third value of whiteness that I'm going to be talking about, is that whiteness is an abusive system. And that is not a flaw. That's what it does. That's what it's used to do. Whiteness and white supremacy are used to control and silence and abuse white people because we're the ones who keep the system running, okay? And the reason I really want to emphasize that is because just like an abusive family of origin, you can go no contact, but that's not going to be enough to heal you. If you go no contact with an abusive family of origin, but you don't deconstruct the things you were taught and you don't heal your trauma, you're still going to repeat those patterns. And what I've seen in the last 10 years is a lot of white people genuinely trying to go no contact with whiteness and white supremacy without healing and examining their own traumas and their own pain and their own things that they've learned, right? And I really need us to understand that because I think it's one of the things that's been inhibiting us from fully moving forward into building this new world that I know so many of us want. For example, we're going to talk about this when I get to punishment, but for white people, and again, this is an emphasis on white people in the United States and people raised in the white women box. So, especially I think, not just for white women, but it's very prevalent in white women culture, is that exclusion is used as punishment. Being excluded, being pushed aside, being left out. These things are done in white women culture. These things are done deliberately to harm, and they're done as punishment for nonconformity and not being good enough, right? So what do you think happens when a white woman who's been in those traumatic situations goes into a multiracial space, goes into a justice space, and a black woman says, hey, we have this space over here. This space is just for us. This space is not for you. Now, it's totally reasonable for a marginalized person to want a space where they feel like safe, and to want a space that's just for other people who share a specific experience, right? But that's not going to be what the white woman hears, because she has not unpacked her trauma around being left out, being excluded on purpose to hurt. So what she's going to hear is, I'm excluding you on purpose to hurt, because that's the framework that she has. And I've seen this happen so many times. And then the white woman crashes out. She has a trauma response, right? She feels like hurt feelings, you know, which then, unfortunately, because of the nature of power dynamics and white women, turns into like harassment and like emotional violence. Ooh, I'm shaking. So I really need us to understand that whiteness is something that we have to heal from. It's not just something that we can walk away from and ignore. These are things we have to deconstruct. These are things we have to examine. These are things we have to figure out in and of ourselves if we're going to be able to interact with marginalized people and Black people, Indigenous people safely. We have to heal those things within ourselves. And that's part of why I'm doing this series, is to kind of highlight these things so that we can examine them. So I really just wanted to emphasize that. And also I'm going to try and make another video later today. I made a little, a stupid little drawing for you guys. I just have to figure out how to print it out. So hopefully I'll figure that out later. But hope you guys have a good morning. I'm putting off doing laundry, so I'm going to answer this question. Do you have any thoughts related to this on the boy mom trend? Oh, I do. This was left on my video where I said that white mom spaces, especially online, are like a really intense microcosm of a lot of these dynamics we've been talking about, the hierarchy, the conformity. And there's something about conformity that I want to talk about more, and that is the false promises of it, right? Because you can't conform your way into a healthy, loving relationship with someone who respects and sees you. You can't conform your way into a good relationship with your kids. You can't conform your way into being happy. You can't. You can't. Just like you can't, like, and I'm going to talk about this more probably, but just like you can't exercise and diet your way out of self-hate, you can't conform your way into the life you truly want. But conformity will promise you that you can. So what I think is happening in the case of boy moms is these are women who were promised that if they were chosen, if they were married, or, you know, in a permanent relationship with a man, they would feel loved, supported, seen, adored. That was what they were promised if they did XYZ. They did XYZ. They got married. And now they don't feel any of those things because their husbands are assholes. And, or maybe not assholes, that they don't have a healthy relationship dynamic with their husband for whatever reason. And they don't feel those things. But they were promised those things, so they feel like they're owed those things. And then they have a little boy. And little boys are super sweet. Like, I'm not saying they're sweeter than girls. Like, but like, they're super sweet. And they love their moms. And so suddenly this woman who has been feeling neglected and ripped off by life, essentially, because she didn't get the relationship that she wanted from her husband, suddenly she has this little boy for whom she is the center of the world, because that's how kids are when they're very small. And she's like, oh, this is how I get what I was promised. This is how I get what I've been working for. And what's up, boo? Sorry, my boy is home. It's spring break. But they're essentially, to me, it seems like they feel like they've been given an opportunity to get those things that they were promised and never received. And so they put all that on their kid, which is, let's be clear, fucked up. Because that is a child. And not your husband. And not your emotional support. And not the source of your validation as a human being. That is a small, tiny person who needs help and protection and growth and is not supposed to take care of you, right? So this is not okay. But that's where it comes from. And so then they become boy moms, and then they become terrible mother-in-laws, because how dare the person who I have been counting on to give me this validation and prioritize me and prioritize my feelings and give me all these things I didn't get from my husband the first time around, how dare this person go and give those things to another human being? So I have to go. Bye.
That I would have liked to experience living back then, as me, Angelina. With my traditional values, a desire to be a busy stay-at-home mother of many children, my cooking skills, and feminine style, I think I would have enjoyed being a 1940s woman.
Drugs.
No, we're okay.
Drugs.
This is awkward. No, thank you.
Drugs.
Who invited?